Heinz Vi Drive here. Beady bop 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 boo. Red bip bop bip bop. Dee 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 dot do. It's hey ha 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 hey. Welcome to another episode of Old Man Goes On at Length. It's time for hot enough for you? Who cares? All right. I really am an asshole. All right. Rent check. I need to deposit that. I rent out the space in my head to all my former enemies. You know, they say you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't let them live rent free in your head. And I couldn't agree more. So I started sending out invoices. It takes a long time, but the extra money I make from it kind of makes up for all the postage. The only thing is that it takes me a month to write out those invoices. There's so many of them. So by the time I'm done, I start on I try to start on the 30th if I can. I go and then I do them and I keep doing them, and then next thing I know, it's the 30th again. This is when I'm getting my hand back. You didn't come here to hear my problems. How are you? First up, the Iron Man and Hellcat annual #1. What do you know about that? So, I need to make up a sign that says tangent alert. I mean, we would never have to take it down. When I was a kid, annuals used to come out annually, by God, and they used to go past #1. That's actually my only real big problem. I realized this, actually, I didn't put this together until recently. I don't know if I went over this, and it's not really the point. Comics never used to change numbers. Like, when I started collecting comics, the X-Men were in the 250s, and the Uncanny X-Men anyway. Fantastic Four was in the 300s. Amazing Spider-Man also in the 300s. Those days are bye-bye. And that's just a thing that my generation of comic book nerd needs to come to accept. We're not doing great. But the older farts I know, believe me, there are older farts than me out there. If that won't keep you up at night, then let me have some of what you're smoking. That's just something we have to let go. Because the main reason for that was that the post office used to charge publishers money to start a new series of magazines. And so they were like, well, hell with that. In fact, I mean, they would often change the title they would change the title before they would change the number. I think the first real instance of that was the old EC comics in the 50s, which were run by William Gaines, but the Entertaining Comics was run by William Gaines. The company began, though, as Educational Comics, right? Yeah. Educational Comics started by Max Gaines, who was William's father. Very devout, very, conservative fellow, very 1950s, clean cut, probably late 40s. This Picture Stories from the Bible was one of their titles, and famous funnies. In fact, Max Gaines more or less invented the comic book, if I remember right, by taking a bunch of reprints of Sunday funnies and making them into a book and put a 10-cent sticker on it, and that was the end of that. Nobody ever heard from comic books again. They were just a flash in the pan trend. So Max Gaines died in a boating accident, if I remember correct. Pretty young, too. But William was a grown man by this point. And I think he had notions of being a writer himself. He was not like his father. His father was very clean cut and straight. William Gaines had long hair his whole life and a big beard. Back before that was real commonplace. And not in the 50s so much. So when he took over the company, he was like, well, education is the last thing I want to do. Educating anybody. So he changed it to Entertaining Comics, and they started publishing comics like Tales from the Crypt and Two-Fisted Tales and Crime Does Not Pay. Well, Crime Does Not Pay might have been his father's. I don't know. But like Two-Fisted Tales, of which I have a set right here. Yeah. Starts at number 18. because it was something else before, which I know what it is. I just can't remember. Because he didn't want to do whatever it was, picture stories from the Bible, for instance. He wanted to make it a war comic, but they couldn't start it all over, so they just changed the title. That was a thing. I probably, well into the 90s. The direct market began in the 70s, but it didn't really take hold until the 90s, where the post office had nothing to do with anything. Post office still doesn't have anything to do with comic book distribution at all, which is good for everybody concerned. Those days are over. Now that it's no longer a hassle, nobody gives a shit, really. The distributors that are in place for comic books certainly don't care, because they're set up to cater to publishers, not the other way around, like it used to be with the post office. You hear me talking post office? This is why you're in such side tangent. I fully support the post office and have done for the last couple of years, and that's something that I really have to take up with the previous administration, because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I hate the fucking post office. Always have done. Anyway, but I still support them. You rest on your laurels. You don't deliver a 9-year-old boy his Weird Al Yankovic T-shirt in 1986. This is what happens. Chickens come home to roost. I'm telling you, it happens every time. Oh, good. Only 7 minutes. All right. Yeah. So nobody can. You add in on top of that the notion that I think it's just psychological. People who don't even collect comics, especially people who don't collect comics, they see a number 1 on a cover. They're like, "Oh, I'll buy this one because this is the first." It rarely is these days. You see a number 1, especially from Marvel or DC. It's a number 1,000 if it's anything. But that brings me to the annual portion of this little rant that I'm talking about. So again, when I was a kid, annuals were a summer thing. Events like major superhero events. I'm talking mostly Marvel comics, but DC was more or less the same. Every summer they would put out a series of annuals, and they were usually pretty gimmicky, and they were just like a crossover. Essentially the point of a crossover, or at least back then, especially back then, was to push books that weren't doing that great. So if they could tie the Punisher into Daredevil, which they often have done, that would boost Daredevil sales because the Punisher was very popular back then. So back in '92, I want to say, in the early '90s, every summer they would do a series of annuals, and sometimes there would be one story connecting them all, like Atlantis Attacks, and sometimes there would just be 4, like groups of 4. So you'd have Daredevil, Punisher, Deathlock, and a 4th guy. Maybe it was 3. And their annuals would all be sequential. So you'd have to buy all 4 to get the full story. Those days are over with. Now, they just, like on a big crossover, which is where they make most of their money, I would imagine, they just they just ratchet up the number of books they put out. So it really started around with Civil War. So you had Civil War was a 6-issue series, but then you also had Civil War Frontline, which was like a supplementary 6-issue series. But a lot of stuff happened in that. Like you kind of did have to read that in order to follow the story. So now you're buying 12 issues. Then it crosses over into Iron Man, Spider-Man, Thunderbolts, da-da-da, BDP, ba-da-ba, boo-da-ba-ba. I still don't even buy all of them. In 1993, they did Infinity War, which has very little to do with a film of the same name. And I was 15. I'm not sure it was 93, to be honest with you. Early 90s, and I was in my mid-teens. And they put out a little Infinity War checklist on a trading card. And I'm like, I'm going to get every goddamn book. And I did. And I felt ripped off. I mean, it crossed over into stuff like Sleepwalker and Darkhawk, which I didn't read, nor did anyone else. Hence why they were crossed over. And now I don't care. Now I see it for what it is. I'm like, eh. But at the time, I'm like, man, what a ripoff. This Sleepwalker story had nothing to do with nothing. And it did not pique my interest in Sleepwalker at all. Ironically enough, now that I'm in a 90s retro shitty comics mood, I would love a run of Sleepwalker. Now what this is essentially, especially in this case, is just the next issue of Iron Man, but with a slightly higher cover price. It's only $1 more, whatever. In the current Iron Man series, which is written by Christopher Cantwell, who's done really well. I've really enjoyed this Iron Man series. Iron Man and Hellcat are a thing, and in the previous issue of Iron Man, he proposed marriage to her. And as I recall, at the end of that issue, she said, "Thank you, but no thank you." But I think they're gonna develop that further here. I think they might still end up together, despite everything and how I look. I'm a big romantic at heart, so I really hope these crazy kids end up together. I mean, Patsy's had it rough. She was married to the son of Satan, for the love of Mary. How many of you ladies can say that? Anyone who I've dated? Okay, fair. But yeah, that's I'm looking forward to this, despite that whole prologue. All right, good. You learned your comics history lesson today. Speaking of which, also this week was Public Domain #1 by Mr. Charles Zdarsky. This has been pretty highly anticipated. At least, I mean, I guess I do get Chip Zdarsky's email newsletter. But even my boss at the comic shop, I came into the shop yesterday, I believe it was, and he goes, "Hey, are you getting Public Domain?" And I said, "Yeah, I like Zdarsky. I don't like everything he does, but I like most of everything he does. And Newburn, in particular, lately has just really been kicking my ass. So I was on the fence about it because I don't need another title, God knows, but it looked good, and I was like, yeah, it's interesting. It's fairly meta-ish, from what I understand. It's about a very famous superhero, the Domain, I think is the character's name, and the creator has passed away, and the character is about to go into public domain. So now his grown children have to deal with that and with his legacy and with his relationship with his children and stuff. So it promises to be a pretty slice of lifey type thing. I get a very Cavalier and Clay vibe off of this. I don't know if you've ever read The Adventures of Cavalier and Clay. It's a novel by Michael Chabon. Cannot recommend it highly enough, especially if you give any kind of a crap about comic books. That's the story of a fictional creative team from the Golden Age and their story throughout the years, and it is good stuff. There's a lot of references to stuff that I picked up on, but you don't need to be well versed. You will be more well versed in the comic book industry once you've read this novel, and also on what it's like to be a gay person in the Depression era, which I certainly had no idea. I've never been gay nor in the Depression. Well, that particular Depression anyway. So yeah, when I walked in and Warren was like, "Are you getting in?" I said, "Yeah, I'm planning on it." Oh, it's so good. He doesn't read that many comics. He doesn't read, especially not like newer stuff. He's got seasons and seasons of Stargirl to watch. But they do send, like, Image will send owners, comic shop retailers, PDFs of these books in advance. And he actually read this one and he said it was really, really good. So I believe it. And then finally this week, this is my pick for the shop as well. This is the Variants #1, Jessica Jones Mystery by Gail Simone and Phil Noto. Two of my favorites. Gail Simone is one of the best writers working in funny books, especially superhero comics, this century by far. She's been around since the 90s. I think her first big thing was Agent X, which was a kind of a Deadpool title, but not really. It was weird. This was in the mid 90s, I want to say, when things were very much in flux. And by that I mean they were throwing whatever they could at the wall to keep the lights on. So they changed Cable to Soldier X, and they changed Deadpool to Agent X. And I think after the fact, it was revealed that neither of those characters were actually Cable or Deadpool. But I only read the Agent X series recently, and it wasn't her best stuff, but it was early. When I first became aware of Gail Simone was when Grant Morrison first came to DC Comics, or came back from Marvel to DC. He launched a bunch of different series because DC was, as usual, getting pounded by Marvel. Morrison had left DC Vertigo to go write for Marvel, and that ended very acrimoniously. So he went back to DC with gusto, and he wasn't going to do the mature readers Vertigo stuff anymore. He wrote Batman and stuff like that. And he also relaunched The Atom, which was a title that I never cared about before. The original Atom is Ray Palmer, and if you're not familiar, he can shrink. That's hence his name. But Grant Morrison introduced a new character named Ryan Choi, who was a college student under, taught by Ray Palmer, or at least very much a fan of Ray. Like, he read all his work and stuff like that. And then he kind of gets thrust into the Atom role, and that's always a fun, like the reluctant. He didn't really want to be the Atom, but he ends up kind of having to be the Atom. So Grant Morrison wrote the first story, which was maybe in an anthology, or maybe it was like a special. That's what I think it was. I think it was a one-shot special that he wrote. And I enjoyed it so much that when they launched a monthly title, I picked it up, even though Morrison wasn't writing it anymore. It was this Gail Simone, who I had never heard of. But she was incredible in that book. That became one of my favorite books. Around that time, DC was doing stuff I really liked. I think Booster Gold, which might have also been written. No. Was it? I don't remember who Booster Gold. It was eventually taken back over by Dan Jurgens, who had written it in the 90s. But regardless, the Atom was where I first knew her. And then she became huge. Birds of Prey, Wonder Woman, those were her big ones that made her. I think, because I don't remember the trajectory exactly of her career, because I didn't read Birds of Prey or Wonder Woman back then. There was a big. She was exclusive to DC for a long time, which was really a bummer for me. But she also wrote. That was the other thing too. So she wrote Birds of Prey and Wonder Woman, which are like marquee names. Like Wonder Woman, obviously, you know. Birds of Prey was like the Bat Ladies, very popular title, a Bat title. So it's but I like, from DC especially, I like the C-list characters, the characters nobody really cares about. She did a teen book in the mid-aughts called The Secret Six, which I loved, loved, loved. It was very much like, it was very Suicide Squad-y. They were all kind of villainous types, but they were trying to do better. It wasn't a government mandate that I recall. I think they were, in fact, on the run, hence why they were Secret Six. And they were just sort of working behind the scenes to save people and shit like that. Great book, though. I loved it. They did 2 volumes of it. There was a big. She eventually came back and wrote a couple things for Marvel, which I've snapped up. Well, I think that went way later. There was a big controversy because she was writing Batgirl and she got fired, and the internet went bananas, which is one of the few times it's called for. And she eventually got the title back, but then she was kind of soured on DC, which who could blame her? And so she's done her own her own indie stuff, which, the titles of which elude me right now. There's one about like superheroes kind of retiring to a suburb, but I don't remember the name of it. I'm pretty sure I've read it. And then she did a Domino solo series a few years ago for Marvel, which was great. And now she's doing the variants. And since everybody's cuckoo for the multiverse, that's kind of what this is, from what my understanding. This is Jessica Jones, Netflix's own Jessica Jones, and these are other Jessica Joneses from other universes. And there's a mystery afoot, and only Jessica Jones can solve it. All of them. But I'm just super excited for another Gail Simone story, especially from Marvel. And Phil Noto is just an incredible artist. I mean, this is not the most exciting cover I've ever seen, but he is an extremely good artist, as you can see. So that makes for a good pick of the week. Wouldn't you agree? Yes. How about last week? Okay, those 2. Okay. What did I read last week? Well, I read New Fantastic Four #1. This was about what I was talking about. It does take place immediately after the original New Fantastic Four. It was written by Walt Simonson. This was when Walt Simonson was writing and drawing it still, I believe. Yes, maybe, perhaps not. Yeah, no, he was. And then, but he didn't draw the New Fantastic Four. Art Adams drew those 3 issues. And the editorial in the back by the editor, whose name I can't remember, talked about, because I think he's probably about my age, and he didn't read those when they came out, but he went back. He had heard when he started collecting comics, people talk, New Fantastic Four, and it was always, and he was surprised to find out they'd only really appeared in that 3-story arc, but they've been fondly remembered ever since. They have been used twice more since, I want to say, but this is the first time it's been like for realies. Like, one of the other ones was an alternate universe New Fantastic Four or something like that. And then I never put this together. There had been a few years ago There was a Venom series that Cullen Bunn was writing that I really liked. There was a Ghost Rider series, right? I think so. Yeah. There was X-23, and was it Totally Awesome Hulk? Yeah, Amadeus Cho was Hulk for a minute, and they did a crossover between those four titles called Circle of Four. And what I never put together, and he pointed, or so maybe it was on I read it online somewhere. Pointed out that was another new Fantastic Four: Ghost Rider, Spider Man, Hulk, Wolverine. Not those, but it was like, oh, that's and I would have enjoyed that. I mean, I'd really enjoyed it at the time, but I would have enjoyed it much more had I realized. So yeah, this is super fun. This is, like I said, written by Peter David, who's never a disappointment. And this Alan Robinson kid, I've never heard of before. I think this is his first thing. Excellent. And again, very Art Adamsy, just like the cover artist Nick Bradshaw, which is not bad. It's never really, honestly, it's never bad to look like Art Adams. He's a great, great artist. Thank you. I also had Beware the Eye of Odin. This was super fun too. This is a quest story where you have a young sort of he's a prince of his land, but kind of reluctantly so. Like his father died, and his people are not really that into him. And then you have the one-armed blacksmith, who's kind of an outcast himself because he only has one arm, but he throws an anvil on a chain around. How badass can he be? And then you have this gal who thinks she's a Valkyrie and talks to a mouse that lives in her hair. And so they have to return the Eye of Odin. That's their quest, and it's super duper fun. I even wrote an email to Doug Wagner. Like, hey, I hope this goes on for a long time, even though I'm sure it will. Because, I mean, everything's like 6 issues these days. I do sincerely hope this goes on for a few years, though, like Manifest Destiny and other Image titles that have lasted a long time, because it's really, really great. Tim Odland, I think, is the artist's name. Also really good. Never seen his work before. Todd Odd. I don't know. And then Punisher War Journal Blitz, which actually turned out to be a one-shot. To kind of go back to the annual rant, they're doing stuff like this too, and it's another $4.99 book. This really should have just been an annual, but they're going to do another one next month or the month after called Punisher War Journal Creed Bob. Punisher War Journal Brother #1, which will probably be, I don't say who the creative team on that is. And so, like I think I mentioned last week, like Tom Brevoort, the editor, considers it kind of like a supplementary series. It's just fun. I'm still gonna buy it, and it's still great. This was really fun. As much as I enjoyed Jane Foster and the Mighty Thor, I like this even more by Torun Grönbeck, and I look forward to more stuff. I think there was something else in there I wanted to point out, but I don't know. But this was, and this is also the new Hate Monger is in this issue. If you're not familiar with the Hate Monger, he was a Captain America villain or a Fantastic Four villain in the 60s, I think, maybe the 70s. And he wore like kind of a Ku Klux Klan type outfit, but it was purple. And then it turned out he had the power to like control people's minds to make them hate. Maybe that was it. He could accelerate, if you will, and make them go crazy, whatever. Turned out it was Adolf Hitler. Whoops. Or a clone thereof. Yeah, that was the big reveal. This Hate Monger is not anything like that at all. Maybe it wasn't in this book. I saw an image, and I don't remember where now, but it was, maybe it was the variant cover for this title, in fact. This just goes back to my theory that the reason they've changed the Punisher's logo is to distance themselves from the right-wing cop assholes who have co-opted it. Specifically, the Punisher logo from the 2004 film of the same name, Punisher logo. And I saw a drawing recently where he like shot that or burned it and put the new one on, but it was, to my eye, very specifically the 2004 logo. And so I was like, yeah, maybe I gotta look at this again. I'm not letting go of this because I really feel like the police have ruined this. As they've ruined a lot of other things, including people's lives, like mine. And I'm really excited for it because I truly feel like once it dies down and once the Punisher is not associated with that logo at all, it might take a few years. Um, they'll bring it back and it'll be a big thing, and they'll be like, this is not the movie logo either, which was frankly always really dumb. Like the original Punisher skull was very, like the head was round, obviously, but like the teeth and like the cheekbones, I guess they would be very squared off, which was frankly more to his character. But when they made that shitty movie, nothing against the great Thomas Jane, who I consider a fine actor, The Mist is now on Netflix. If you haven't seen it, I rewatched it the other day. It's great. Um, they made that shitty movie, and one of the shitty things about it was they're like, let's make logo more edgy and meh. Go fuck yourself. So it's not in here, but I will point out that in a flashback sequence with Frank, he's wearing his jacket zipped up over his original logo. So you can't have it anymore. The cops is what Marvel, I think, is trying to say. And frankly, thank you finally for addressing this. I mean, I wish it didn't have to concern changing the logo, but unlike most comic book nerds, I don't hate change just for change's sake. That was a phrase I got bandied around a lot at the old shop that I worked at. Ah, change for change. They're just changing it for change's sake. That's not what they're doing here, but I don't give a shit, even if that was what they were doing. I hear that. I heard that all day today, as a matter of fact. I haven't worked a Wednesday in a few weeks, in fact. I did work last Wednesday, but there were a few Wednesdays there that I had, for different reasons, had to take off. So I wasn't there for New Comic Book Day. And boy, are those guys exhausting. And I heard this phrase several times today, and I hear it all the time at the shop. They'll be talking about something, a change like this, and they'll go, just no. If that's your argument, just no. If you can't articulate what it is about it that's upsetting you, then shut the fuck up. I don't care what you think. Get your own YouTube channel, and then you can go on at length as to why you like or dislike something. But that is a lot of people's, and it's a very, 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 very common thing in fandom just to have that kind of knee jerk reaction to any kind of change. And I've said this before, I think, but I get it, because the reason a lot of people, myself included, get into comics is because that comics represent a world where there are rules that are followed, and where the good guys win and the bad guys lose, and that's not always the case. And that's but that is what the attraction is. It's a form of escapism that does that, and also, like, kind of tangentially but still connected. It doesn't change. Peter Parker is Spider-Man. Bruce Banner is the Incredible Hulk, etc., etc., etc. Again, it will change, and it has changed, but those are still the basics. And when you're a big nerd and the world is terrible, that sort of structure, you know what I mean? You go out in the world and anything can happen. You get wedgied when you're not expecting it. I never got wedgied. I didn't really get bullied at school. My parents chose to home bully me. That's a joke that I wrote. It's actually very good. But yeah, that sort of thing, there's all kinds of chaos like that. And so comics are more ordered. And a lot of guys like myself, who already have a lot of psychological problems as it is, they attach to the Marvel universe and they're like, okay, this makes sense. I know what goes on here. I know what the Punisher's logo looks like. I'm safe. I don't have to worry about things changing for no reason or for reasons unknown to me. So when they do, because they always do, because you're not even safe in the Marvel universe from change, a fact that I've come to accept, but I'm in the minority. Oh, the mic's over here. When you have fixated on that and then things change, it's very upsetting, and I understand that it's upsetting. You went into this thinking you were getting Reed Richards, Johnny Storm, Susan Storm, and Ben Grimm as the Fantastic Four. And then you show up one day and She-Hulk is there. Well, what am I supposed to do now? I laugh because it's funny, but it's also kind of a bummer. All right, good. End on a bummer. Shit, I really wanted to end at 30 minutes exactly. I'm going to wait till it comes back around.